Continuing from where we left off in the previous session, I ended the previous session by asking three questions. These were three questions that were intended to provide some framework to enable you make the best of the crisis we find ourselves in. The questions were, where am I? That was the first question. The second question was, where am I going? What is my target? And the third question was, how do I get there? I concluded by saying that I would separate each of those questions into individual sessions so I could spend some time and share some thoughts and some ideas on perhaps how best to deal with and how best to make the best of the answers that are related to each of those questions. But I felt that it was possibly not the right path to follow. And here's the point. Before we go into those questions, let me spend 10 minutes and present or paint. Just imagine having a canvas, a white canvas. Let me paint on that canvas a picture. And the intention of that picture is to help you consolidate some thoughts and some ideas. Perhaps let me share why or the purpose or the importance of what I'll be sharing in this series. In other words, answering those three questions are important, but why? Let's begin with basic economics. I've often defined economics as the subject or the discipline that tells you or that tells us as a group what we've always known in a language that we do not understand. If I spoke to your mother, or better still, your grandmother, or your grandfather, there are certain conversations that I would have with them, and they would just answer those questions, if there were questions in those conversations, in such an easy way, and you could see the wisdom in their responses. Why? Because they have common sense. We in our generation, we've almost traded common sense for intelligence. I had a conversation with a friend of mine not long ago, and in the conversation I said, we were talking about a potential problem that had to do with this crisis. My response was very simple. I said, I think the best way you can resolve the dilemma of this conversation is to turn off your intelligence, your IQ, and turn on your common sense. That in many cases, intelligence is the enemy of common sense. And if there's one thing you should always choose common sense. Speaking to your grandparents or someone from that generation, they had common sense. They did not have all of the IQ or the knowledge or the training, but certain things from experience just made sense. Economics is very similar. Unfortunately, today, our generation, we depend too much on economists and the intellectual group to tell us how to think, what to think. And we never stop and say, but why? Or we never stop and say, but does that align with common sense? To understand this crisis we've found ourselves in on the economic side, it's important to recognize what we call the cause effect, but more importantly, the after effect. And so when I started the previous session, I was trying to encourage or suggest that there was a way to benefit from this crisis. There is a saying, never waste a good crisis. And I said, you start by, first of all, identifying where you are, identifying where you want to get to, and figuring out how to get there. But I'd like to perhaps just take a step back and just explain on the economic side why the time we find ourselves in is once in 100-year opportunity. If you've studied economic or financial history, you can only find a period that could be potentially analogous to the period we're in now. In other words, something similar. The time in mind is the 1929-1930 period. Why? Because we had the Great Depression. Now, there have been since then so many other events. You go back to the 1987 financial crisis, where the stock market fell 25% in one day. One day. But if you go back to the 1929-1930 crash, what happened originally was a recession, which led into a depression. It wasn't just a depression, it was a recession. We had started to recover from the recession, but certain governmental decisions caused the depression. Most people who study financial markets get that wrong. They believe it was the failure of capitalism that caused the depression. It wasn't. The failure of capitalism caused the recession. In other words, exuberance, excesses. People got too optimistic and they bought things without asking the question, what's the value? They overpaid. And the market corrected the errors. In other words, there were corrections, which is what we call, whenever there is what we call a market correction, it's a euphemism for when you lose a lot of money, or when some people lose a lot of money. That correction is naturally inherent in a free market system. Simply means that the market will go through cycles of excesses and corrections. Excesses when people get too optimistic, corrections when people become less optimistic and a little bit more pessimistic. In between the excesses is what we call value. In other words, the fair value of an asset, of a company, or of a product or commodity. And so the market fluctuates based on the psychology of the people. Richard Feynman once said that physics would be much harder if electrons had feelings. Human beings have emotions. Sometimes our emotions cause us to go to excesses. And after a certain period of time, we get or come back to our senses and we correct. So in 1929, 1930, there were excesses and then there was the correction. The correction was the recession. Unfortunately, the government made a decision. You may have heard of something called fiscal policy or monetary policy. The important to remember is this. The decision that the government made caused the depression, and the decision was simple. In 1913, the Federal Reserve Bank was created. One purpose: control the quantity of money with the intention of ensuring that the prices of goods were stable. As a result of the recession, the panic in the market caused many people to have what you call a run on the bank, meaning everyone rushes to the bank to withdraw money. And therefore, the quantity of money in the United States, specifically, because that's where it began, reduced by a third. And when you have the quantity of money reduced by a third, that creates a catalyst for further economic issues. And that led to the depression. People are holding on to their money. People are unwilling to buy and sell. And if you remember that one person's spending is another person's income. If you don't spend, I don't earn. And that means the country is brought to a halt because people are not spending. That caused the depression. Now, if you study financial history, as a result of a poor behavior by the Federal Reserve Bank in not making sure that there was enough money in the economy, so they failed on their most important duty, which is control and maintain the quantity of money. As a result of allowing the quantity of money to decline by a third, we had a depression. The Federal Reserve Bank learned from that experience. Today, if you study from the 1934 crash onwards, or the period of that crash onwards, from 1940 onwards, every time there has been either the potential or the possibility of a recession or a market correction or an economic correction or downturn, the Federal Reserve Banks or the central banks of most large governments or countries, they do the opposite. They flood the system with money. Now let's bring that forward to this crisis we find ourselves in. It's a public health crisis that is going to lead to an economic crisis. Let's be very clear about something. We are already in a recession, a global recession. The question is, how quickly does this recession recover? And will this recession lead to a depression? This time around, the depression will not be based on the 1930s cause. Back then, it was failure to maintain the quantity of money. So the quantity of money fell by a third. Since the 1940s onwards, the Federal Reserve banks have been very quickly to put too much liquidity into the market. So you flood the markets with money. If you study the decisions by the government since this public health crisis started, an observation has been most central banks have reduced the interest rates down to almost zero. It always follows a pattern. First, the governments are trying to enact both monetary and fiscal policy. The governments are trying to make sure that they control interest rates. They try to control inflation. In addition to that, they make sure that there's enough liquidity. There's enough money circulating because people need to spend. In addition to that, they combine that with ensuring that the government controls its taxation rules, and the government starts to enact provisions which will result in either government spending. Since this public health epidemic has begun, there have been promises made by the federal governments of most large countries. People will be paid to stay at home and work, or not work. Businesses will be bailed out. Now, the key thing to remember is governments do not create wealth. They only spend the wealth that has been created. Every government can only do three things in relation to the money it spends. It can tax and then spend. It can borrow and then spend, or it can print money and then spend. When you tax, you're effectively taking money from your present self. When you borrow money, you're taking money from your future self. When you print money, you're taking money from your future self. In other words, you're relying on the future and you not having enough available capital of money to spend on things that are important to you. Why? Because you borrowed the money in the prior years. So the key thing to remember is this. The governments have started, the first thing they did was they reduced the interest rates almost down to about zero. Why? To stimulate the economy. What would that do? Very important. And I'll talk about that shortly. The next thing they've done is they've enacted measures to flood the system with money, so there's liquidity. Now, they haven't started printing money, although they are about to, but they've started to borrow. Now, when they cannot borrow, because every single country in the world has the same epidemic, no one will buy some of the government bonds. If they cannot sell their bonds, in other words, if they cannot borrow money from the public, they go to de facto position number 3, which is to print. So the Federal Reserve Bank, the Bank of England, the Euro Central Bank, the Japanese Central Bank will start printing money. It's a 3-step process. We've done the first, we're now in the second, and we've already started the process of authorizing the banks to go to the third. When you print money, what happens? Inflation goes up. And it's a lagging indicator. Inflation doesn't go up immediately. It usually takes about 2 years. So the first thing to remember is, as we look into the future, inflation will be high. And that simply means the purchasing power of the currency in the country you live in is going to go down. That is a fact. Because it would take you more dollars or more pounds to buy what you may have bought a year ago, to buy it next year. Now, what does that mean? It means you need to understand how the game will play out, because all of this slush money being pumped into the economy will have consequences. There is no free lunch. There is no free lunch. There'll be consequences. And as a result of the global epidemic, and although the government are doing their best, I always like to tell people, In many cases, in most cases, good intentions by good people cause bad outcomes. Bad outcomes are not simply from bad people. It's usually meaningful, well thought through solutions put forward by good people, people with good intentions, but uninformed and unwise people looking to do good, and unfortunately, they produce negative outcomes. I've always said to people, always remember this word or this statement. No one spends someone else's money as carefully as they spend their own. And there are four ways to think about money and spending money. There is money you spend on yourself. That is the best and most efficient and effective money that can be spent. There is when you spend your money on other people, but it's you that earn the money and you spending your money on other people. There is you spending other people's money on yourself. And lastly, there is you spending other people's money on other people. The fourth is the most inefficient and the most ineffective. And that's where we are right now. The government is spending other people's money, the future's money, on everyone else. And the people allocating this money are not very wise. Now, why is this important? Well, the economic downturn or the recession, which could become a depression, I hope it doesn't, will cause a displacement and a transfer of wealth across all spectrums. You need to be able to be in and on that train. In the last 100 years, there has not been, and there will not be again for another 100 years, the wealth transfer that we're about to see. That means that if there is one thing you need to do during this, what we call shutdown period, during this stay-at-home period, you've been given, in effect, 12 hours every day, where you potentially, depending on what country you live in, if you live in the West or some parts of the East, you're being paid not to work, to stay at home. You need to use this time wisely. My recommendation is you need to learn. The most important thing I would be looking at is financial education. How do you prepare yourself for the opportunity of a lifetime? In conclusion, let me leave you with this. And I used this in the last session. If you look at airline stocks, and if you look at hotel stocks, and if you look at cruise line stocks, and if you look at oil companies, most of these sectors have lost about 75% of their market value in 3 months as a result of this issue. If you lose 75% of your net worth, how much would it take to come back from that 75% loss back to where you were before? In other words, how long would it take, or how much would it take? How much would you need to earn or make to break even back to where you were? I asked a friend that question today. And he said 75%. If you lose 75% to break back even, you need to gain 75%. That is the answer most people will give. The answer, and the real answer, is 300%. Now just think about that. To break back to where you were, you lose 75%, you need to make 300%. And I gave the example, I said, if you were investing in the United States, and on average, the United States stock market, the S&P 500 has earned about 10% on average over a 50-year period. In order to earn 300%, if you were making 10%, how long would it take to make back that 300% which you need to break even? That's an easy arithmetic. You simply divide 300 by 10. It would take you 30 years. So I don't know who you are. I don't know where you're from. I don't know what your experience has been. But what that says is that for those who had wealth, to come back to where they were, if they lost 75% of their wealth in some of these companies, they need 30 years if they were earning the average return. And that means you have been given, if you invert that conversation, you've been given 30 years of extra investment time frame or horizon. 30 years. If you were not investing from 2009 or before, don't worry about the past. You've been given an opportunity. Why? Because there's been a shift of wealth. The wealthy have lost a significant part of their net worth. Everyone starts again. And there's a question that was asked to, I believe his name was, I believe it was John Paul Getty, the wealthy oil billionaire back in the early 1900s. They said, either John Paul Getty or the guy who developed Standard Oil, his name escapes me now. It may have been John Paul Getty. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The question was, what would happen if we took all of your wealth and distributed all of your wealth across everyone in the United States? And he says, I'll make it all back again in 5 years. Now, why could he say that? Why could he be that confident? Now, the mistake most people make, and the erroneous philosophy most people have, is to think that the rich steal from the poor. How can you steal from someone who is poor, who doesn't have anything? Wealth follows management. Wealth follows intelligence. Now, J. Paul Getty made that statement because he was of the opinion that he already had the wisdom, the knowledge, the financial education, the understanding. He knew how to create value. So he said, no problem. In 5 years, I'll go back to doing what I do well, and wealth will be attracted to me. In this period we have, you've been given an opportunity of a lifetime to become attractive to the marketplace so that capital flows to you. And that's why in the sessions to follow, I'll be going through a process of understanding where you are, where you're trying to get to, and what you need to do. And I hope you enjoy it.